Today I'm going to be reviewing Alienware's brand new value-oriented laptops, the 16 and 16X Auroras. The 16X feels more modern and competitive with other laptops around this price point. It has a current-gen CPU, a decent screen, and modern bells and whistles, like facial recognition. I've been using it for about a week now, and it's okay. I can see people who like the Alienware brand being drawn to it. The 16, on the other hand, has a CPU that's based on tech from 2 years ago and a bad screen. We worry that it degrades Alienware's brand. Josh was hoping that they'd launch this laptop under the Dell brand, which is what they used to do for their cheaper gaming laptops. As per usual, Dell's pricing is all over the map. At the time we made the video, the better 16X was actually cheaper than the 16, and both had the same GPU. On the GPU, the other issue with both these laptops is that they max out at an RTX 5070. For a similar price, you can get a laptop with a 5070 Ti, which is much more capable. With that said, here's the review. Let me know at the end which one you would get, if at all. One of the biggest differences between these two laptops are their CPUs. The more expensive 16X Aurora comes with one of the highest-end Intel options from their current Arrow Lake generation, the Core Ultra 9 275HX. Because of this, the 16X does well in both single and multi-core, performing around the same as other high-end gaming laptops with this chip. The 16 Aurora, on the other hand, comes with a processor that looks current, as it has Core in the name, but it's the Core 7 240H. It is actually a refresh of Intel's 2-year-old Raptor Lake line. That's why it's missing the Ultra. The 16 Aurora with the 240H chip performs about as well as chips found in thin and light gaming laptops like AMD's Ryzen 9 and Intel's 185H chip from 2024. Moving over to Cinebench, which tests the processor when it's maxed out, we see a slightly different story. Here, the Aurora 16X continues to trail the Strix G16 with its AMD HX3D processor. That is essentially an AMD desktop processor shoved into a laptop. You can also see that Lenovo's Legion Pro 5i, with the same Intel HX processor as the 16X Aurora, is pulling a little ahead of it. The 16 Aurora with its Core chip lands at the bottom here, and even though it doesn't perform very well, it still draws more power than the newer chip in the 16X does. This just highlights the fact that Raptor Lake was a very inefficient architecture. You can also see this inefficiency when we look at how hot the Core 240H processor gets. It's almost as warm as the 275HX chip in the 16X, despite its significantly worse performance. Switching over to TimeSpy to measure gaming performance, we see the 5070 and the 16X Aurora do about as well as we'd expect, similar to the Strix G18 with the 5070, and about as well as the underwatted 4080 in last year's Zephyrus G16. The 16 Aurora with its Core chip and a 5060 comes last. It is fed significantly less wattage than the Strix G16 with the same GPU. Next, we'll look at Port Royal, which is a ray tracing benchmark. The lower wattage 5060 in the 16 Aurora does the worst, unsurprisingly. Now let's talk gaming, starting with Forza Horizon 5. The 16 and 16X see some decent average FPS and 1% lows, but the 16X does better than the Strix G18 here with the same 5070 GPU. The next game we'll look at is Monster Hunter Wilds with DLSS frame generation off and upscaling on. Monster Hunter Wilds is an example of a game that really needs more than 8 gigs of VRAM, especially at ultra settings. Both these laptops only have 8 gigs of VRAM and, as you can see, have terrible 1% lows. The same as the Strix G18. What's surprising, though, is that the older Zephyrus G16 with its 8GB 4070 didn't seem to have as much of an issue. Perhaps it's due to its AMD processor? We'll have to do some further research. Anyway, if you want the best performance in more demanding titles at this price point, you'll want to lower the settings or try to get an RTX 5070 Ti. Moving over to Final Fantasy XIV's Dawntrail benchmark, the 16X actually does very well here, even beating out the better GPU in our thinner Predator 16S. This Aurora 16X really outperforms in this test. The Aurora 16 with its 5060 does okay in average FPS, but the 1% lows seem like they wouldn't be super enjoyable. Switching over to Cyberpunk with frame gen off and upscaling on, we see a similar result from the 16 Aurora. The 16X falls behind the Strix G18, which is disappointing. Switching to DLSS frame gen on at 2x settings, every laptop sees a big boost in average FPS. But this comes at a cost. 1% lows are much worse. Next, we'll look at the Puget benchmarks for creative tasks, starting with Premiere Pro. The 16X with its 5070 falls behind laptops with 5070 Ti's, but it still does really well. It performs significantly better than the 5060 and the 16 Aurora. Some of this may be due to GPU power draw. The 16 Aurora with its 5060 still does well, though, about the same as last year's Zephyrus G16s with the 4080. This may be because the 50 series GPUs come with additional hardware encoders for 10-bit footage. Anyway, all of them beat out the MacBook Pro 14 with the higher-end M4 Pro chip. That laptop is more expensive than most of these. Looking at DaVinci Resolve Studio, the 16X now ties with the Predator with its 5070 Ti, so it's a good result there. Our MacBook now does much better, which makes sense as DaVinci tends to favor Apple's Metal. All of the benchmarks we've shown you so far are run in the highest performance mode, overdrive, but you may not always want to do that. It comes with trade-offs like more heat and fan noise for minimal performance gains. Starting with the lower-powered 16 Aurora, here's how it does in its different modes during our CPU-only stress test. But what if you're gaming? In this case, we would probably recommend overdrive, despite its higher fan noise, as you are still getting much higher average FPS and slightly higher 1% lows. That's because the GPU is being fed around 10 watts more power. The keyboard deck does get a bit warm though, so if you wanted to sacrifice frames for a cooler keyboard deck and significantly less fan noise, you could go with performance. Now we'll look at the higher performing Alienware 16X Aurora in its different modes. Oddly enough, it actually got the best CPU score we saw in balance mode, but not by a ton. We'd normally recommend running in that mode, but the keyboard deck gets uncomfortably warm. For CPU tasks, you might be better off in the performance mode just so it runs its fans enough to keep the keyboard deck cooler. Looking at gaming on the 16X, we see a similar result to the CPU stress test, with the middle two modes getting the warmest on the keyboard deck. The average FPS numbers aren't necessarily bad in its quiet mode, so you could game on that if you want to avoid the heat and fan noise almost completely, or we recommend going for overdrive and just wearing headphones. Interestingly enough, the cooling solutions on these two laptops are slightly different from each other. The 16X's fans appear to be thicker, which aligns to the laptop being about 1 millimeter thicker. The heat pipes, CPU, and GPU of the 16X are also on the other side of the motherboard. To accommodate for this, the keyboard is moved ever so slightly forward, likely for the air intake. Don't worry, it's not as far forward as older Alienware laptops where your hands slipped off the palm rest. Back on the 16 Aurora, the vents are arranged slightly differently. Looking at the back of both of these laptops, Alienware claims this design of sucking in air through small vents allows them to force the air onto the heat pipes, offering better cooling. We are not convinced about this. We'd prefer more intake vents and more airflow. Compared to other similar laptops around this price point, they don't heat up as much during CPU-only tasks. They fall around the middle of similar laptops. For fan noise, the 16 Aurora is about average, while the 16X gets the loudest, tying with the Predator. Moving over to comparisons while gaming, both of these laptops are on the upper end of fan noise, while being about average for heat you feel on the keyboard deck. This really just goes to show how effective the Asus Strix G16's cooling solution is. Sure, it is a bit thicker than these Auroras, but not by much. When we look at performance on battery, these laptops throttle quite a bit. This is somewhat normal among gaming laptops. As far as how long these laptops last on battery, the lower-powered 16 Aurora does quite well. Nearly 8 hours for Microsoft Office tasks, and almost 10 for playing a downloaded movie on repeat. The 16X gets about 6 hours for both of these same use cases. Compared to competitors, the 16 Aurora has some of the best battery life we've ever seen on a gaming laptop. This is especially surprising considering there is no iGPU-only mode like we see on some of these other ones. Let's now get into the look and feel of these two laptops. We feel they look nice enough. They are nearly identical, with matching build and port placement. The 16 Aurora appears to have a plastic underside instead of metal like the 16X. When you have the laptops flipped over, the 16X does look more unified with the same blue finish throughout. The 16X is ever so slightly thicker, as I said. Both are about the same size as the Strix G16, just a tad thinner. This means they are around average for a mid-range gaming laptop. Unfortunately, they are heavier than the competition. Both the Strix G16 and Legion Pro 5i are lighter. Those laptops have similar components to the 16X and better components than the 16. One reason for the weight on both of these might be the fact that the chassis feel sturdy with minimal screen and deck flex. The front edge of the laptop has a nice curve downward that leads to your wrists feeling comfortable in typing, but there is a bit of an edge underneath it you might notice if you don't have wrist support. Last thing about the chassis, the location of the vents on both of them means you may get hot air blowing on your mouse hand. Some people like Josh and Seth use their mouse closer to themselves, so it's not an issue for them. Next, we'll look at the displays on these laptops, which are very different from each other, despite both being 2560 by 1600 16-inch panels. The 16X has a brighter display that gets over 500 nits of brightness, while the 16 is only around 360. As far as color gamut goes, both displays cover 100% of sRGB. The 16X has better P3 coverage of 99% versus the 16's 77%. The 16X also features a higher refresh rate of 240 Hz. We even noticed some ghosting on the 16 non-X version, which we don't typically see on a 120 Hz gaming laptop screen. Fast-moving content sometimes smeared on screen. This is not good. Both displays have a matte finish, which should help minimize reflections, but the brighter one on the 16X will likely do a better job of combating them. Both displays support G-Sync, but do not support Advanced Optimus, which means you have to reboot to switch between DGPU and hybrid mode in the Alienware Command Center. There is no option for this in the NVIDIA control panel. We did not detect any major backlight bleed or PWM flickering on either of these panels, which is nice to see. The 16X still has a much nicer screen than the 16, though. The keyboard on both of these laptops seem identical to each other, from layout to typing feel. They feature a standard layout with a numpad on the right side, which the Strix G16, for example, doesn't make room for. Their arrow keys are a bit small, though, which Josh is never a fan of. They are also squished together with the page up and down keys above the left and right arrows, which could cause accidental presses. The power button is on the top right of the keyboard as well. The 16 Aurora only has a white backlight, while the 16X has single-zone RGB. They both have 1.4 millimeters of key travel. The keyboard is not the most comfortable at this price point. It feels low travel and mushy, but there is a subtle click, which makes it a little bit better. The trackpad is mechanical and clunky. Tracking feels a little grippy and not perfectly smooth. The click feels accurate enough, it's just not a great trackpad. Pretty much par for the course in this more value-oriented category. Let's talk ports next. Starting with the 16 non-X. On the left, we have a headphone mic combo jack, a 5GB USB-A port, and a 1GB Ethernet port. On the back, we have the proprietary charging port, an HDMI 2.1 port which supports an external display going direct to the dedicated GPU, two 10GB USB-C ports, one of which supports DisplayPort 1.4a, and the other one supports charging. Then there's another 5GB USB-A port. The 16X version of the Aurora has almost exactly the same ports, except the USB-C port that supports DisplayPort is Thunderbolt 4 instead, and supports up to DisplayPort 2.1. On both these laptops, the MUX switch does apply to the USB-C ports. If you are using DGPU only mode, they go direct to the dedicated GPU. If not, they go via integrated. The speakers appear to be the same on both laptops. They unfortunately don't get very loud. They have some bass, but are lacking in clarity in the midtones and instrumentals. Nick and I felt that it just sounded smeared or muddied in those middle registers. Here's how the webcam looks and sounds on the Aurora 16. This one is 720p, does not feature IR for Windows biometrics, and neither of these webcams offer a physical privacy shutter. Here's how the webcam looks and sounds on the Aurora 16X. This one is 1080 and does feature IR for Windows biometrics. For Linux, we booted up Fedora 42 and everything worked as expected. Speakers, brightness up and down, trackpad, webcam, etc. Upgradability and maintenance on both laptops appear to be pretty good. The back is a little difficult to take off as there are 10 Phillips head screws, 2 of which are seated in the top left and right corners. Once you get the back off, though, you can see an empty SSD slot that would accept either a short 2230 or longer 2280. The SSD the laptop comes with is also upgradable. There are 2 DDR5 SODIMM RAM slots, which means you can replace or upgrade your memory easily. The Wi-Fi 6E or Wi-Fi 7 card, depending on which configuration you get, is also replaceable. So is the battery. Let's wrap things up. Between the two, we certainly think the 16X is more competitive if you plan to get one. It has a stronger processor, better screen, and facial recognition. The 16 Aurora, on the other hand, doesn't really have anything going for it and costs nearly the same as the 16X at the time of writing this. We feel that one should be purchased around $1,000 or less, if at all. But before you go out and buy the better 16X, we'd strongly recommend you also consider similarly priced alternatives like the Strix G16 and the Legion Pro 5i. We feel these laptops offer a little more. On a big sale, you may even be able to find one of those with a 5070 Ti for around the same price. That would make a much more capable gaming machine. When you go to compare pricing on these laptops, try our website, bestlaptop.deals. We call out if a laptop's current price makes it a good or great deal. We track prices across retailers so you can see when it's at its cheapest. You can even set a custom price drop notification so you'll receive an alert when one of these laptops drops into your budget. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Until next time, go do something awesome with your day, and we will catch you later.